My name is David Brown. I have a blog called The Trinity Troodon, and I'm the author of an ebook on zombie movies called Revenge of the Revenant Review. This is what I have planned as the finale of a series of videos on zombie movies. I'll be talking about what I consider unknown zombie movies, and to me, that the big standard there is what I would call spontaneous encounters. If I see someone mention a movie without me looking for it, uh, and this is where things can get really unpredictable. There are movies that were very high profile that are unknown. Then there are movies that would otherwise be obscure that are reasonably known just because of how well the fandom will look things up. And I'm also going to count a few that aren't really unknown in and of themselves, but they aren't widely discussed as zombie movies. Now, the first one I'm going to get to is called Maniac. It's from 1934, and it's already notorious. It gets called one of the worst films ever made. Sure, it's up there, but it's nowhere near the bottom. Really, it comes from a time that would have the worst films ever made, but then it's so far back that a lot of the actual worst, which I've ranted about in my video on worst movies, are just plain gone. So this isn't by any means good, but it is kind of interesting. And the weird part is it starts when it actually is doing okay, literally with two guys bringing a woman back to life with a serum, which is identical to Reanimator. Of course, now we know it is the movie, but the story would actually have been published more than 10 years before this. Uh, and what's even makes it even weirder is that doesn't really have anything to do with any of the events later in the film. And that really, in a nutshell, is the problem with this thing. Nothing makes sense. Nothing is really connected to anything else. And that can be entertaining in stretches, but you'll most likely be worn out well before the end of it. Now, another one that's just random is much better, and I'm already jumping forward. This is a 1950s movie called Fiend Without a Face. Now, with the B movies, people get the idea of all science fiction films being B movies. This really, for the time, was medium budget. The real B movies would be where they were made by people who didn't know what they were doing, mostly, and who had no money to do it right, even if they had known how. Compared to those, this is much more professional. It's still very weird, and there's a lot that doesn't make sense. So the plot is that some science experiment is either created or summoned creatures no one else can see. When we finally do see them, they're these disembodied brains done with stop motion. So obviously these are not zombies. Where I argue for zombie adjacent is that there's a finale where there's people trapped in a farmhouse and the brains, which we can now see, are trying to break in. So that right there is like a preview of Night of the Living Dead more than 10 years earlier, and it's enough to wonder if George Romero had seen this movie. He already acknowledged several movies, especially Last Man on Earth in Carnivals of Souls, which I've covered in my top tier video. But this one, if anything, is the most similar. And another thing where I find it zombie adjacent, the way it's portrayed, the brain creatures actually eat people's brains, which in itself is what you got with Return of the Living Dead. But my headcanon is, what if maybe uh, they're the people whose brains were apparently eaten really had their brains turned into more of the creatures, which would kind of make it a zombie movie or zombie adjacent, but that's just my own take, which I'm sure was not intended. Now, moving forward, I have another one. I might not do this in strict chronological order, where there's a lot of room for argument what to even count it as. It's called Tourist Trap. With this movie, it was by the Charles Band crew before they'd really gotten to their feet. It was released at the end of the 70s, and it was actually given what you call a 70s PG rating, even considering what they got away with under 70s PG. This is an incredibly disturbing film, and that also means it is not a fun watch, definitely not nearly as fun as you might think from the premise, which is just that there's a guy running a tourist attraction with mannequins, only he can bring the mannequins back to life or to life to kill people, and then the way it's portrayed, the people he has killed, he turns into more mannequins. Now, where I find this at least zombie adjacent is that the villain, which I would definitely call the main character, he's played by the guy who was also in The Rifleman. Uh, he is at least comparable to a zombie master, and this does get to what was always the idea of voodoo zombies. You're not afraid of the zombies themselves, you're afraid of the zombie master, and especially the zombie master turning you into a zombie. And a further headcanon I get out of this is that everyone, or almost everyone, besides the villain, was a mannequin all along. That's mostly my headcanon, but where I also get that is that it was partly based on at least one Twilight Zone episode that did have that as both the premise and the reveal. uh, and again, this is a very disturbing film. I have had someone walk in when I was watching it who was not at all squeamish and then walk out after about 10 minutes. So you can consider that kind of an endorsement. Uh, and then for the biggest concentration of really unknown zombie movies, there is going to be a bit of a paradox. The most really unknown zombie movies are really the relatively late ones, and I think a big part of that is the nature of the fandom. When Dawn of the Dead and then Return of the Living Dead and Reanimator were coming out in the 70s and 80s, they were pulling the really first generation fandom, which partly was already there with Night of the Living Dead. But then it was only until about the 2000s when the fandom was picking up again. So the stuff that was in the middle, neither generation was really paying attention to. And the one in this time frame that's I literally cannot explain why it's not better known than it is called Two Evil Eyes. And the mind boggling thing about it is it was made by George Romero and Dario Argento, who both worked together on Dawn of the Dead. And it's based on the work of Edgar Allan Poe. So, if anything, this was their attempt at a prestige picture, which may be the part that kind of backfired. So, what really gets it in here is the first segment. It's based on the Poe story, The Case of M. Valdemar. I know that's not the full title, where they've updated it so it's kind of a soap opera plot. There's an old businessman who married a stewardess. When he's dying, the stewardess and her lover hypnotize him to make him rewrite the will. And when he just dies, not apparently by murder, since it doesn't help them, they hide his body in the freezer until they can finish fabricating a will. And what happens then from there, which is mostly following the story, is that they can still hear the guy talking. You see close-ups of the body, and it's really graphic in its own way, not bloody, but it's obviously dead, pale, and they do very visible frost around him, which they would actually have had to use special tricks for, just because between body heat and camera lights, ice can't exist under those conditions for long. And you see that his lips aren't moving, but you still hear him talking. So it really turns almost into psychological horror, to the point you could argue either way, whether it's real or they're imagining it, at least apart from the fact that they do both hear him. Then right at the end, he comes back to life. Even then, he doesn't exactly attack anyone. He just goes after his wife, and when she tries to shoot him, you see some graphic hits, but nothing happens. And it's a little ambiguous what happens then. There's a struggle for a gun. You hear a shot. You don't really know if it was who did it or if they intended to. And then they work in a Lovecraftian angle where he keeps warning them that there are other entities that are being attracted because he hasn't gone from the land of the living to the dead. And that leads into a really freaky finale I won't talk about. Now, it's easy to get the idea from that the other part of it, which is based on the Black Cat, isn't worth talking about. That is by no means the case. If anything, this is probably one of the best things Argento did, though if you really know his stuff, that's a little bit backhanded praise. It's just not in the zombie genre, beyond the fact that it does have some significant gore. And this is also the segment where they got Harvey Keitel. And that right there makes it interesting. He was also in, of course, From Dusk Till Dawn, which I've considered for this list. I'm still not sure if I'm getting to it. Now, for really unknown 90s zombie movies, another one where it definitely is understandable that it's not well known is called Ghost Brigade. That was one of several titles given to it, and I just double-checked that is the name I'm going to go with, in part because it's the one that at least gives you an idea what it's about. It's a zombie movie tied into the Civil War, which wasn't unique, and that was one of the things against it. They'd already had something like that with a movie called The Supernatural, which had Nichelle Nichols, and also LeVar Burton, so two Star Trek actors, though, of course, LeVar Burton wasn't on Star Trek yet. And that movie, I think, also created a bad reputation when people mix them up, which I did myself at one point. But this one is certainly much more interesting and flat out well done than the Supernaturals. With that one, I've really debated if it belonged on my worst zombie movies list. The main reason it wouldn't be there is just that I really remember almost nothing about it. But Ghost Brigade, by comparison, it's certainly memorable if you've ever seen it. And what's strange about it, it's a very low budget movie. It ended up being released direct to video. I think it's very likely what they originally intended was for it to be a TV movie, either network or cable. So it's clearly very low budget, but they actually have a very high profile cast. They got Martin Sheen, they got another guy, Corbin Burnson. He was on Psych, and did a lot of other TV character actor style roles, including ones appearing as one of the Q on Star Trek. And the one really that people like me would recognize, they have Ray Weiss as a supporting character. He was in Swamp Thing, and he was one of the bad guys in RoboCop. More recently, he's mostly done Christian inspirational films, but this was when he was a high profile actor. And what's most interesting about it is that they really make it a demoniac style zombie movie. That's already something out there where there's shades of gray between what you call a zombie movie, especially with the Evil Dead series. Here, what definitely seals that it belongs in the zombie movie category is that it's all tied into a voodoo curse. And this is something where they actually take it seriously. They even really make a meaningful portrayal of what voodoo Vodun is as a religion, uh, especially that it does have a real sense of good and evil. So the whole setup is that the voodoo spirits are bringing people killed in the war back to life. That's the big difference from the Supernaturals. Here, it is during the Civil War, and then they're attacking both sides. And what makes this impressive is that these zombies are very smart and very actively evil. The only other movie that really develops this to that extent is City of the Walking Dead, which I've covered now in a separate video. So they talk. They do seem to show their former personalities, but that could just be to make the people they're going after even more frightened. They use weapons and real tactics, and they are flat out sadistic. So that right there makes this a very unique zombie movie. If you can get past the very low production values and some of the issues with the pacing, it's very rewarding to watch if you can find it. And really, your only good option is going to be YouTube. There might be some of the old DVDs or tapes out there, but I wouldn't count on it. And another one from this area that's really the era that is, that's really a borderline case is called Shatter Dead. So with this one, it was pretty much an amateur movie, not in the strictest sense. There were definitely professionals involved, but they were low level. The person playing the lead role was a model. As I understand it, most of the other people who were involved were just crew who had worked in advertising or music videos. It is at least then competently shot. And what really makes it interesting to watch is that it has a completely deranged premise, very deconstructionist. The whole idea is that the dead are coming back to life, only instead of attacking people, generally they just kind of wander around and act depressed that they can't go back to being dead even if they want to. You do have them trying to develop the idea of some of the zombies turning militant like Black Panthers and then killing living people, but it's not that a big part of the idea. Really, if anything, this could have been better without it. And what is definitely working against it, it has a lot of violence and gore, but a lot of that isn't done very well. Plus, the acting, it's mostly competent, but it's definitely not a professional level. And there are a few things where they try to do something that was weird and could have been good, but they just didn't have the money to do it. Especially, there's actually a scene where you see a pregnant woman give birth to a zombified fetus. And even that's kind of toning down what happens. That it's been done and it could have been done well, but here it's just not working. It's all obviously fake, and that they could have done better without. Still, it's not a good zombie movie. I gave it about 2 out of 4, which is as much as it deserves. But if you can actually get it and it's been in and out, it's definitely still worth seeing. And really, there's much more you could build on it. One is certainly the idea of zombies that don't actually attack people. The other is having something like a zombie apocalypse, but still have society functioning. And that, it's really hard to think of any examples. The two I could give would be Fido and Maggie, which I'm not going to cover otherwise. Still, there's so much more we could do with that. I might try it again myself sooner or later. So that's really getting towards the end of what I planned. I can make this a lightning round, though, and cover a few more. One that's a little bit unknown is Night of the Living Dead 3D. I mostly knew about it because I saw it on Redbox. When I finally watched it, it wasn't that good, but it was one of the better low-budget 2000s movies. And that might be faint praise, but it's something. And another, this might end up going out of order. I did, though, definitely plan to cover this, is an animated movie from around 2012 called The Amazing Adventures of the Living Corpse. It's based on a graphic novel, and it's done with CGI animation. Really, the tier the animation is at is PlayStation graphics and probably about early to mid 2000s or even 1990s PlayStation graphics. So it looks very rough. It's still a very conceptually interesting film. It's another one I'd probably give 2 out of 4, mostly for effort. And it does develop interesting characters and an interesting story. It's another one that's kind of episodic. This does mostly work in its favor. If anything, it's one that gets a little weaker towards the end, but they do build up to a real conclusion. The whole idea is that you have a character zombie who starts fighting for the good guys against other living dead, and these are really freaky. There's one in particular, it's really just about a Greek lamia. Very grotesque, but very tragic. It's supposed to be a mother whose her husband and child brought her back to life, and she says she's looking for a child, but every time she meets someone, she'll just not just kill them, but it's implied eat their soul or life force. Uh, and at the end, it has the living corpse and his son, who is still alive, fighting a mad scientist trying to raise an army of the undead. Same usual deal. And this does lead to a very effective ending, which I won't go into. I had another take where I said more about it. The one thing you could really say against this is it would have been so much better if they had been able to do regular cell animation and really done it right. If it had been in the style of the EC comics, like Tales from the Crypt, the made up pastiche comics and Creepshow, or looking forward, Watchmen, like Tales of the Black Freighter, this could have been a classic. As it is, certainly it's worth watching, and I think I can work in at least a couple more. And this is still moving forward into the 2010s. One I'll mention is Life After Beth. It doesn't really belong here because it was pretty well known and had big names. It's gotten a little bit obscure. I think it's another one where it's in a fandom blind spot. It's really a remake of Dead of Night, which definitely had potential, and it's pretty well done. And one I never reviewed except covering it in my zombie movie ebook is called Daylight's End. That was from about 2016. It's really like an unauthorized adaptation of I Am Legend, of course, long after the Will Smith movie, though not a long time after either, like within maybe 8 to 10 years. What put it on my radar at all is that it had Lance Henriksen in a supporting role. It's pretty much standard zombie apocalypse with fast zombies. They tried to play them up as vampires rather than zombies, which they kind of are, but the whole vibe is still very much post-apocalyptic zombie movie. And it's another one that could have been done better, but it's still very well done. The best scene is very early on. You have a guy hunting the undead in a structure, and he realizes that the undead have used either an actual dead body or one of their own, crippled or dead, as bait. Well, they tried to set up a trap, and where it starts to drag, which you do see a lot, is towards the end, though the main thing there is that it doesn't really go with the earlier premise. It's been portrayed that they're fully intelligent, they have weapons, they have tactics, but when they're really in the final battle against the living survivors, 90% of the time they just charge in mass, which still works because they really are physically formidable. It's definitely something that should have been better known. The big thing is just that it came out right at the end of the new zombie movie wave. And one more I'll mention is called Wyrmwood. This was one of the New Zealand Australian films. I believe Australian. We think of them together when they really shouldn't be, but there is actual overlap in their film communities. That is one that's just insane. It starts out as close to a standard zombie movie, but it gets much, much weirder. And that is spelled Wyrmwood, W-Y-R-M, then Wood. It's also called Road of the Dead, which was the name of George Romero project. Everything I've been able to learn, they had no relation to each other. If you can find it, I watched it on Netflix when they still had the video, the DVDs. It might or might not be worth watching, but if you want something really far out, it's way up there. So that will be enough for me to fill this out. For anyone who's been with me this far, I will be coming back to this. I think, if anything, I do a little more on the high tier, especially Romero zombie movies. And anyone wanting to read feedback, you can certainly leave your own ideas here. For now, I'm signing out.